Hello, friends, and welcome back to Market Shares. I'm your host, Tony Blodgett, and today I thought I would just take a couple minutes and give a quick market update, just kind of what's going on with the market. You know, we've talked about the Fed. We talked about that last month. The Fed, has not lowered interest rates. They are giving indications, though, that a rate cut is probably coming. All indications are pointing towards that happening probably at the September meeting. And I think some of what I'm going to share here today is going to support that. Still kind of a mixed bag with a lot of economic indicators, including the stock market, would lead you to believe that things still seem pretty resilient with the economy. But I gotta say that most of what I'm going to talk about today has me feeling like we have definitely tilted more towards a market pullback. Dare I say the word recession? I definitely think it's possible that we find out at some point in the near future that we actually were in a recession. Here it is in the month of June 2024. We'll see how that ends up unfolding, but things are starting to kind of point that direction. Now, before I get into these slides and I want to share, I will just say that in my lifetime, most of the recessions that we've been through, with the exception of the housing crash in 2008 and 9, were not necessarily bad for real estate, because what typically happens is interest rates get better. And with interest rates getting better, homes typically fare fairly well. It improves affordability, and house prices, tend to go up in an environment like that. Now, it's kind of hard to believe that home prices could go up any higher because, as you'll see, we are at all-time record highs in the housing market, despite how difficult affordability is, with home values continuing to go up, interest rates still not low by any means, although they have improved. So we'll see. But, typically what we see in a recession is a pullback of consumer spending. We'll definitely look at some consumer sentiment today, which is going to tell you why I'm feeling like things are not great as far as the way the consumer is feeling about the economy. So we'll see. And I don't know that we have a super clear path, but I'm going to share with you some of the data, let you make your own determination. And as I promised here on Market Shares, we will continue to do market updates in between our awesome interviews and sales strategies and the other things that we talk about here, because I do think that not only is it important for you to be aware of what's going on in the market, I feel like as a mortgage professional, myself and everyone watching this, if you're in the mortgage and real estate industry, you should know this stuff. You should be a student of what's going on in the economy, because it helps you be prepared. But more than that, it helps you share that information and education with your clients. And I think clients look to professionals like ourselves for a window insight into what's going on in the economy, and we can definitely be that person. So let's jump right into it here. I'm going to share a few of these slides up on the screen. I want to make sure I look at them as I go here so I don't get this information wrong. But some of this I thought was really interesting. I think you will also. So as we look at this first graph here, home sales, there have been just 2 months in the past decade with fewer sales than what we saw in May of 2024. So that's kind of shocking. Very few transactions happening out there. Now, despite the low number of transactions, we did see home values reach an all-time high. I'll show you that slide in just a minute. But as I was saying, despite higher rates, despite, very few transactions happening in the marketplace, and despite higher values that just keep going up, we're still seeing home values continue to increase. Now, this is an interesting slide, and one that has kind of evolved a little bit over the last 2 years. So, one of the things we talked about after the pandemic was over and rates started to pivot there in the first half of 2022 was I heard numbers as high as like 90% of all clients out there have an interest rate under 4%, or maybe that was under 6%, but 80% or so were under 4%. What this graph shows us is that over the last couple of years, with all the transactions that have been happening, right now we're sitting at 63% of all outstanding mortgages are under a 4% interest rate, which means that the good news is that, 37% are above that. Now, 38% was the number before the pandemic. So before the pandemic, only 38% of outstanding mortgages were under 4%. Now it's 63%, and it was as high as almost 80. So that's good news. That tells us that if we do see a shift in interest rates and this cycle kind of moves into a lower interest rate environment, there's definitely more opportunity today than there would have been a couple years ago with all those transactions that have taken place. So that is good information to know. On the inflation front, now we continue to see pretty good inflation numbers. I mentioned interest rates have been improving a little bit recently, and that's because we've continued to see good numbers on the inflation reports that have been coming out. Here's more good news. This is on import and export prices. Imports down 0.4, exports down 0.6, just continuing to show that inflation is looking better. Now, this is not really great news, but not horrible news. Expectations for 1 year inflation, so this is a forecast of where we're going to be in 1 year from now, remained unchanged at 3.3%. Now, we know that the target that the Fed's looking for is closer to 2%, while expectations for long run inflation ticked up to 3.1 from 3.0. So not horrible, but not great either. We definitely want this number to be trending down long term. That's what's going to give the Fed the confidence they need to lower rates in September. I think we're going to see more information on the employment front and with CPI and PCE that are going to still give them the ammo they need to drop rates in September. Probably the only drop we're going to see this year would be my guess at this point. But we'll have to read the data, as Fed Powell would say. But this one is interesting. Now, consumer sentiment. This is what I was referring to earlier. Look, consumer sentiment has dropped significantly most recently. So you can see at the end of this graph, that's really 2024, the last couple months, we've seen a huge downtick in consumer sentiment. And it took a really big hit. And what's interesting about this, in my opinion, is that it's not really in line. This data is not really in line with the general sense we get about the economy, right? We hear about the stock market, doing well. We hear about the overall economy is good. You hear this from, a lot of the talking heads on TV, political TV, so on and so forth. But the data tells us that consumer sentiment has definitely turned negative. Now, this slide talks about the reasons why people feel like their personal finances are poor. And this is the percent of people who would attribute inflation to their current poor economic situation directly. And I think it's interesting. You look at the red line, and that's going to be your income. That's the bottom percentile, but look at the dotted line. It's actually a little bit higher if you can see that on the graph. That's your middle percentile. And it is interesting. Typically, inflation impacts the lowest income earners the worst. But yeah, what we're seeing is those middle income earners, the middle class, if you will, is being or feels like they're being the most impacted by inflation. Obviously, the high income earners are top percentile, always going to be quite a bit lower. They're not as impacted by inflation. We know that. But it is interesting that the middle America, the middle class is being impacted significantly by inflation. They're feeling it. Another slide here on consumer sentiment. Look at that most recent end of the chart there, how it dives down all the way to 54 when it was up above 80. So this is sentiment around real income growth over the next 1 to 2 years. It's the lowest it's been since 2012. This is a consumer sentiment towards what their projected income is going to be over the next 2 years. That's kind of a grim outlook, if you ask me. We haven't seen the likes of that for over a decade. European wage growth is recovering while U.S. wage growth is faltering. So we're seeing this, wages faltering. A lot of mixed numbers in the employment numbers. I feel like employment is, it has some decent reads recently, but we know that this is second jobs, third jobs, part-time jobs. We know that the jobs that come from the self-employment sector are not real accurate with the death birth ratio and so on and so forth. So I expect to see not just this continue faltered in wage growth, but also a little stumbling on the employment numbers. You guys, that's what I think the Fed has really been waiting for in order for them to feel like they can pull the trigger. We know inflation's coming down. We see little signs here and there of it, possibly popping back up, but it's, they have a dual mandate, and the other one is full employment. So when this thing turns, the Fed will take action. Delinquency rate on credit card loans is back to where it was in 2010. If that is not shocking, that was right after the big financial crash. So defaults on credit cards peaking where we have not seen them in a very long time. This graph is showing us that banks are not as willing to loan out money to consumers. Now, this is a sign of, I think, a couple things. One, some weakness in the banking sector. I think it's also has to do with, the weakness of the consumer and their ability to repay debt, given how high the interest rates are on this. And partly it shows us that consumers aren't looking to borrow as much either. And you guys, this will drag down the economy somewhat, right? When interest rates are this high and people either can't or don't want to borrow money, look, we're a society, we're an economy that's driven by debt. And when consumers have less access to it and or less likelihood of taking out debt because it's so expensive, it's going to have an impact on how they're spending their money because they're usually spending somebody else's money. This graph right here shows home prices. This is what I was talking about. June 9th, highest median home price ever, all-time high, $394,000, up 4.4% year over year, despite all the headwinds that we've seen in housing. This is absolutely insanity. Now, this is interesting. Home prices also, though, have peaked as far as the number of price drops. So listings that have had a price drop is up to 6.5%. We have not seen this number since November of 2022. Now, all these other, you see three other graphs on here, three other lines on this chart. This is only 21, 22, and 23. So this is not like some long history of home prices. So it does look, it does look like it's a little concerning with the number of price drops. What it tells me is that people are shooting for the stars, right? People are listing their homes too high, thinking that they have even more equity than they actually do. And maybe that's going to correct itself. And with the, velocity of home sales, because there's been so little inventory and the amount of people going for that, they could get those, pie in the sky numbers. But maybe what we're seeing as inventory starts picking up, this is typical around spring. We talked about this on our episode with Anton. You're going to see a little bit more inventory. Thank God, we need it. But hopefully it gets people to chill out a little bit on what they think they can get for their home. So, but something to keep a close eye on, because if we start seeing a lot of price drops and or that starts leading to a decline in values, something to watch out for. I will say, there's definitely evidence that there's markets around the country Florida in particular, if you haven't been watching any of the news or, YouTube channels out there, I watched a report just about Florida's market. Now, in fairness, this was right in the area of Florida that was hit by a hurricane just 2 years ago. And from what I understand, the beaches were decimated. I still don't think it's returned to its glory, if you will. And so we went from a couple of years ago in that market. I don't remember the exact zip code, but I think it was in the I'm not remembering the market, but nonetheless, 2 years ago they had about 80 listings in this one zip code, and now there's 800. That's 1,000% increase in listings. Now, this is just in one small part of Florida, but there is talks that there's other markets around the country that are seeing this more rapid increase in inventory that may lead to a softening in prices in certain markets. Now, my first thought is, look, what's the big deal? Like, that's, we all know that as soon as interest rates start coming down, there's going to be more demand. We have lots of pent up buyers. I mean, I've talked to a number of loan officers who have tens, if not hundreds of pre-approved buyers who have not been able to find a home. We know those people are anxious to get into the market. But you can't ignore the fact that there's certain pockets around the country that maybe went up a little bit too high. I've heard, markets like Florida. I've heard things about Tennessee. I know Boise has had some, talks about, is that an overpriced market? I don't know. Time will tell. I've looked at homes over in Boise just to see what's on the market. I got to tell you, it looks like a pretty healthy market to me, but time will tell. I think these are things that we need to be honest about and really keep an eye on. So we'll make sure here on Market Shares we do that. The last slide I want to show you here is PPI. And this, again, just more evidence that producer price index continues to improve. Slight tick down here in May. And I think further evidence that it's going to support the Fed doing some sort of a rate cut in September. So you guys, those are the couple slides I wanted to share with you, and just a little update on what's going on in the market. Look, the good news is we're right in the throes of the spring market. I feel a lot more activity. We see it evidenced in our numbers. Interest rates have gotten a little bit of relief. I personally think in most markets around the country, now would be an opportune time to get into real estate if you can afford to do so at current interest rates, because I personally believe most markets have a pent-up demand. I've heard economists talk about this massive rush of inventory that people think is going to come on the market. I mean, shoot, we were talking about this a year and a half ago here on this podcast, that there may be inventory from things like, we talked about Airbnb, right? The people that bought a bunch of Airbnbs realizing like, okay, this is a lot more work than I thought. I've had vacancies, I've had repairs, it's expensive. Maybe I don't want to be in the Airbnb business, right? We've seen, other institutional lenders that we've heard are going to be unloading their inventory. We just haven't seen that yet. Again, maybe certain pockets here or there, but I don't know. I'm personally not at this point buying into this doomsday prophecy that we're going to see just inventory materialize out of nowhere, given what we've seen in the market as of late. But time will tell, and I promise you this, if it changes, if we start seeing those, one commitment I'll make to you is I'm in the housing market, I'm in mortgage and real estate, I'm an investor, but I also believe in the truth and facts and what's really going on. And I will bring to you on Market Shares what I see, the good, the bad, the ugly, and hopefully it's good, because most of us work in real estate. But if it's not, we should know about that. And then we should think about how do we understand that information, strategize with that, and be able to communicate that to our clients, and so on and so forth. So we'll make sure that even if it seems not that favorable, that you get our perspective at least on what's going on around the country. As I see interesting articles, I'll make sure that I share them with you. So you guys, that's today's episode of Market Shares. I hope that you had some takeaways from this. Look, I feel pretty optimistic about where interest rates are going to go as a result of this. I'm slightly concerned about a recession that may be coming. But here's the thing. What do you think the Fed was trying to do? The Feds don't raise rates the way that they have and keep them there for as long as they have without pain. We talked about this early on when they first started raising rates. Their goal is to create pain. There hasn't been much pain as a result. Now, there is for certain people, but we've brought inflation down from almost 9%. So, the goal was to slow down the economy. It looks like it's working. Now, let's just see how they react as these numbers really start showing up. We know that it takes a long time for a Fed rate hike to work its way through. I feel like we're starting to see it. And it's going to be a critical few months on what do the economic indicators tell us? How does the Fed react to that? How quick are they to react to that? And can they bring this thing in for a soft landing? Or are these signs that I'm seeing now that are pointing towards a pullback and a recession going to accelerate and the Fed stays flat-footed and waits too long? I mean, history tells us that's what's going to happen. We'll keep a close eye on it for you and let you know. As always, thank you so much for tuning in to Market Shares. If you're listening, thank you for listening. If you're watching, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please like and subscribe so that you don't miss future episodes as we continue to unpack what's going on in the market. And I'll give you my 2 cents on how to best, take in that information and maybe repurpose it to help you and your clients and your referral partners. And if you want to make sure you don't miss an episode, it is important to subscribe because they come out every Friday at 10 a.m. and you don't want to miss one. So I appreciate you guys tuning in and all the great feedback that we've gotten about Market Shares. And until next time, take care.